Thanks for the invitation to be part of this lecture series. In particular because this event is honoring Agneta Fischer for her incredible work as Dean of the Faculty of Social and Behavioral Sciences. As Justus was already hinting at, I guess that her job was quite an emotional one. Or rather that she had to deal with a lot of tensions with emotions running high. I vividly remember that the times Agneta and I had to deal with some issues, emotions were often blocking solutions. People felt very much entitled to their feelings, which was not always helpful to find compromises. In other words, Agneta was the right person at the right moment. I guess these days one has to be a scholar of emotions to be a good dean. Or perhaps we should reconsider the role of that emotions play in academia, but that's for another occasion. In all modesty, I wasn't sure whether to accept today's invitation, given that many colleagues at the faculty are more qualified to deliver this lecture. Look at the wealth of studies carried out regarding emotions in many disciplines within the faculty and at the crossroads of disciplines, like, just to mention, at the Hot Politics Lab, in the research priority area Real Emotion, and in IC, Amsterdam Interdisciplinary Center for Emotion. Moreover, compared to other disciplines, particularly to psychology, social psychology, sociologists came worldwide rather late to the study of emotions, even though there are important exceptions, such as American sociologist Arlie Hochschild. And speaking about exceptions, let's not forget that Amsterdam sociology has been rather exceptional, at least compared to other sociology departments in the Western world. My colleagues did pay more attention to emotions than elsewhere, as part of the Norbert Elias School. But what have sociologists to contribute to the study of emotions? Why should sociologists study emotions? Well, actually, for many reasons. First of all, because emotions are deeply social, and that in various ways. We all have to develop emotions by learning from others, and we understand their meaning by interacting with others. Moreover, we are all aware that emotions help us navigate the social world. May it sometimes be in a very clumsy and insufficient way. Today I will not discuss these obvious sociological aspects of emotions, but I will rather use the sociological lens to look at the increasing importance attached to emotions in public life, and in politics in particular. Emotions are worldwide increasingly embraced as a salient part of the political arena. Especially populist leaders show antagonistic emotions in debates, and their statements, speeches, and public behaviors incorporate emotional appeals and strategically elicit negative emotions about other groups. Political discussions in which viewpoints are exchanged in a rational and balanced way seem sparser than polarized discussions these days. Emotional appeals suggest authenticity, even veracity, in a context where facts do not count that much anymore. This afternoon I will mainly argue that there is a lot to say in favor of the idea that emotions in politics can be a risk to democracy, and that for three reasons. First, when emotions replace arguments, or rather become arguments, it is true because I feel it like that, then emotionalization doesn't make the political arena more inclusive, but on the contrary, exclusive. If justifications of actions in highly emotional terms are valued more than argumentative ones, then democracy is indeed under threat. Second, of course, it also depends on which emotions matter in politics. And unfortunately, rather exclusionary emotions such as belonging and feeling at home have traveled from the private to the public and political sphere. And third, The emotionalization of politics is not only at the expense of arguments or excluding citizens who allegedly do not belong, but it threatens democracy also because it exaggerates difference and it polarizes. I think that it is really worrisome and telling that affective polarization is much stronger than other forms of polarizations in this country. Since affects, emotions count so much in politics, and since emotions are more polarized than our ideas, our practices, or our behaviors, our political landscape has become more polarized overall. To overcome this polarization is also far harder than in the past. To compromise over emotions is very difficult because one has to be empathetic to other people's sentiments. So yes, emotionalization of politics is a serious threat, and I will elaborate these three aspects in a minute. But at the same time, I like to acknowledge that the increasing importance attached to emotions in politics can also have an emancipatory, democratizing effect when emotions of all citizens are taken into account, when all emotions count. Recent mobilizations by farmers, for instance, could be understood as a cry for recognition. They want their feelings to be taken seriously as well. So I try to be nuanced, but before I will explain why I think that the negative aspects outweigh the positive ones, let me start with some contextualization. And one caveat, I will not deal with topics such as definition or terminology, emotions, sentiments, moods. I use them rather interchangeably for the moment, but our specialist, Agneta, Fischer will deal with those questions for sure. Context, the emotionalization of society and politics. Obviously, emotions have always been part of social life in general and more specifically in politics. The classic work of Gustave Le Bon, some of you might know him, 1895, already reflects the presence of emotions at the heart of political movements, when he describes the social movements at the end of the 19th century as primitive, impulsive, and emotional crowds. After the fiascos of the fascist and communist movements in the first half of the 20th century, the trust in emotional politics did not necessarily increase either. Passions had to be banned from the political realm because they formed a threat to democracy as such. And to be clear, right, there are subtexts here. So women particularly were depicted as extremely passionate and emotional, less in control compared to men. There's also a class subtext, right? Proletarians being far more emotional. There was a racial subtext, for instance, for sure. Of course, children are always more emotional. So there is this idea that subordinated groups were always perceived as more moody, as irrational. Passionate politics often culminated in the rise of authoritarian politicians, men, and charismatic leaders who successfully built on and orchestrated the emotions of the masses. This was also the risk in a highly divided country such as the Netherlands. In the context of a polarized and pillarized society, there was a shared goal among the Dutch elites, and it was to pacify these tensions. Pacification, as most of you will know, became the bread and butter of Dutch politicians, intentionally blocking the masses to engage in meaningful forms of political participation. Active participation of citizens was perceived in the Netherlands with distrust, particularly when ordinary people organized themselves collectively in social movements. And it was the case at least till the 1960s. So whereas the study of social movements that started after World War II disqualified mass mobilization as being overly emotional, the next generation of scholars took a more positive stance towards mobilizations by citizens, however, without explicitly appreciating the role of emotions. This approach mostly emphasized the rational character of mobilization, as did the political process approach that highlighted the opportunity side of mobilization. Rational actors would mobilize when success chances increased. However, since the 1960s, paradigms developed that assessed the constitutive role of emotions in mobilizations of civil society and in politics at large as far more positive. These changes occurred during what we call the long 1960s in many Western countries, as part of a process called by sociologists the informalization of social relations, which meant that formal rules to regulate interactions became less important, while informal ways of dealing with one another became more important. In these informal interactions, the role of emotions was explicitly acknowledged and valued. Emotions were embraced as showing one's authentic core. Informalization thus implies the collapse of rigid boundaries between the private and the public sphere. And as we all know, authority was questioned everywhere, at home, at the workplace, in politics, at universities. However, the strict demarcation between the private and the public realm not only blurred because of informalization slowly shifted to new ways of interacting, it was also intentionally produced by active citizens who claimed that the personal was political. Indeed, a slogan, of course, popular in the feminist movement. This implied in the first place a more sociological perspective on the causes of assumingly individual personal misery. Inequality was not a given, but could be changed by social and political action. But more important for this afternoon, secondly, the feminist movement created the space to talk about emotions collectively and to bring these emotions in the public realm. In the words of Arlie Hochschild, social movements and the market together changed what she called the display rules of emotions. As a result, a far more positive appreciation of publicly displayed authentic emotions became the new norm. To quote my colleague Hurekamp, one could speak of the collapsing of the private and the public and the requirement that everyone should publicly reveal the most intimate feelings, thoughts and behaviors. Perhaps we come to this during the discussion, right? But, well, watch a political debate between presidential candidates, how emotional that is, or Pieter Omtzigt. Showing one's emotions is not only something that is done these days, but it is also valued, and as if it is showing the authentic self. This general trend towards emotionalization can also be observed indeed in politics. Emotions have become increasingly manifest in the political arena worldwide. As has been mentioned, especially populist leaders express antagonistic emotions such as anger and contempt. The use of polarizing emotions, however, is not restricted to the far right or the far left. The growing opposition between the Democrats and the Republicans in the US, for example, has become a source of hate-based identities, leading not only to fierce opposition in parliament, but also indeed in private life, to broken family ties and broken friendships. Finally, the emotionalization of public and political life may be related to the blurring of the private and the public, but is now further reinforced by, of course, the widespread use of social media, where private and public can hardly be distinguished anymore. It's often unclear whether heated opinions and emotions and emotional expressions on social platforms are posted as individuals, as employees, as experts, or as politicians. In addition, the posted emotional expressions are often raw and extreme, without considering the effects they may have on the receiver. Boring and balanced videos are not effective. Analysis of emotions in social media show that messages containing emotions are far more often commented on and retweeted. Thus, the display rules, Arlie Hochschild, that once governed both the private and the public expression of emotions have become obsolete in the digital world. the absence of any social implications of one's emotional expressions, which seems partly due to the anonymity of the medium, has resulted in an outburst of self-focused intolerance accompanied by hate speech, as many of us know or have experienced. Let me first go to the positive and then to the three negative aspects. Everybody counts, the democratizing effect. What does the emotionalization of the public and political realm mean? One implication is that it has increased emotional involvement in politics more broadly. Emotional narrative and expressions make the political arena more engaging indeed for a broader audience. Ordinary feelings such as anger, pride, or compassion have become explicit parts of political narratives and identities. Populist policies emphasize the importance not only of emotions in doing politics, but also of experience. And since everybody has emotions that should be heard, the recent emotionalization has a certain democratizing effect. Given that everybody has emotions, right? Whereas knowledge is more unevenly distributed. And I guess, but that is perhaps up for the debate if you want, I guess the emphasis not only on emotions, but also the emphasis on experiences and on an experiential knowledge, ervaringsdeskundigheid, ervaringskennis, can have the same democratizing effect. Right? Because it is more inclusive. People have those experiences. And people who have been in marginalized positions now claim a position in the debate because they have suffered, right? So they have that specific experience. And then it can become more inclusive because more people can participate in the debate. At the same time, it can be more exclusive because it is very specific who has had those experiences, right? Not everybody has had those experiences where all of us have those emotions. So perhaps we can discuss about that. Anyway, populists will claim that some groups have been neglected by the elite, an elite that misses these emotions and experiences, because the elite being alienated, cold, disembodied cosmopolitans. But by pushing this agenda of democratization, populists dramatize and exaggerate differences and paradoxically create cleavages, mainly affective cleavages. Let me give one example. The urban-rural divide is perhaps the best example of this mechanism. From a long-term perspective, it might be obvious, I think, that differences between urban and rural areas in the Netherlands have really decreased, not increased. I would even claim that from such a perspective, differences have never been so small as today between the urban and the rural. As our colleagues Twan Huismans and Emilie Miltenburg have shown, and I quote them, differences within the city or differences within the countrysides are much greater than between the two, end of quote. But nevertheless, BBB voters, for example, experience a large mental gap, which they express in rather emotional ways. The Randstad is said to have insufficient attention for the region. Decisions are made over their heads. They want to be treated equally. It is painful for them that the gap between the Randstad and them has not been yet completely closed. Caroline van der Plas embodies this cry for attention. She stands for emancipation. She wants to overcome the polarization between the urban and the rural. I admit it is quite a favorable reading of her, but I think try to understand her in that way. Try to understand the BBB in that way. But I have to acknowledge, paradoxically, in the end, she contributes to affective polarization, right? And that brings me to the three anti-democratic threats that I already briefly mentioned. If the political sphere becomes heavily emotionalized, the public sphere runs the risk, paradoxically, to become a quasi-private place, where dissenters are not welcomed and where critics of one's own political beliefs easily become one's enemy in personal life. In this way, political emotions can pose a threat to democracy, giving group-based sentiments such as anger, contempt, or fear a central position in the political debate that may amplify the polarization and pose a threat to democracy, where compromises and negotiations are still crucial. This is particularly evident in the increasing importance, my research topic, the increasing importance of belonging as a specific sentiment that has to play a role in politics. Claiming that the Dutch or the French should feel at home poses a threat, a direct threat to democracy as such, because citizenship is then not based anymore on equal formal rights, but on emotions. It becomes culturalized and emotionalized. And with this culturalization of citizenship, citizens are subjected to, what Hochschild mentions, to new feeling rules, right? That render belonging or feeling at home a requirement. Especially immigrants are expected to demonstrate feelings of attachments, belonging, connectedness, and loyalty to their country of residence. But it is not just actually just about immigrants. Just give one small example, perhaps some of you will know that those of you who live in Amsterdam, our local government has as an aim that we all feel more at home in Amsterdam, and that should increase by 2% per year, which is totally ridiculous as an aim, I would say, and as a target. But it is interesting as such, right? So what the hell is going on there? So emotions then, and the government is interfering in our emotional this idea, right? So many things happen there, but it illustrates the argument that politics have become more about emotions and that politicians think that they have to interfere there. But which place should emotions then have in the public and political debates? Better incorporating emotions in political discourse is clearly effective, I admit that, in broadening political interest. However, emotions should never be considered as the sole justifications of one's decisions or support of political narratives. Because there's something special about emotions, right? Emotions are urgent and always demand priority. And we also know that they bias one's perceptions and one's judgments. Perceiving one behavior of a politician as morally unjust easily translates to blaming the politicians for everything he or she or they ever did, or by extension reproaching the party he or she or they belongs to as morally corrupt. Accepting group-based sentiments as part of the political discourse may result and is resulting in affective polarization that overshadows and amplifies the actual differences out there among citizens regarding opinions, beliefs, dreams, and daily behaviors. And that brings me to my last slide. Yes, at the political level, there is indeed more polarization than before. Or more precisely, increased emotional polarization, affective polarization, as political scientists call it. But that does not apply to ideological polarization. Although we disagree on some topics, such as migration, in fact, to quote our colleague Harteveld, when he summarizes numerous studies, I quote him, "On many subjects, the Dutch have grown considerably closer to each other since the 1960s. So effective polarization is far bigger than polarization in many other things. Therefore, we should raise the question, even if emotions should have a place in politics, have emotions not become an obstacle to the future of democracy, given that effective polarization in our societies is much stronger than other differences among citizens? Is the attention paid to effective polarization not a risk in itself to overlook those long-term congruent developments? It is important to acknowledge the specificity of effective polarization compared to other forms. Increasing effective polarization versus convergence in terms of other cleavages and divides. We shouldn't think that the increased polarization in terms of affects mirrors empirical development in terms of opinions, behaviors, practices, or routines. Most differences have become smaller among Dutch citizens. except, I have to admit, differences in wealth. The only increase what we see in reality is an increase in differences in wealth. All other differences among the Dutch have decreased, apart from affective polarization, which makes it so special. But most differences have become smaller. Male, female, gay, straight, brown, black, white, theoretically or practically educated, we have never been so alike. At the same time, we accept fewer and fewer remaining differences. Our anger about those remaining differences fuels affective polarization that suggests that differences are even growing. Since affects, emotions, count so much in politics, and since emotions are more polarized than ideas, practices, or behaviors, our political landscape has become more polarized overall. But you have to be very aware that that is just the case for affective polarization. Finally, affective polarization is also more difficult to deal with because it is emotional and not rational, or at least not or less open to rational arguments. So, this rather old white man concludes then that emotions are risky after all. What's new? Thanks.
So that's easy, right? To go against his conclusion. So I first want to thank the AISSR to have organized this double lecture. So I want to thank Bert Bakker and Gijs Schumacher for organizing the Hot Politics Lab, which I think is a very good source of inspiration for everything that's going on over here in terms of emotion research. I also want to thank Disa Sauter, my dear colleague, who is the person with whom I share lots of emotion research. And I want to thank all the emotion researchers who are present here. Okay, so Jan Willem's take-home message is a warning. Emotions have become a risk for democracy and lead to more effective polarization. This may be a very wise political analysis. However, where does it leave us and what does it say about his view on emotions? That is my question. So I have a mentor and my promoter, I had one because he has passed away, who is Nico Vrijda. And I want to take a step back and say something about the definition of emotions, as Jan Willem already announced. So Nico Vrijda wrote this book, The Emotions, in 1986 already, and it was called The Emotions because he was not a very modest man. And what is very important is that he started with concerns. Concerns is everything that we value. Goals, your identity, your self-esteem, what you want to be, everything that you think is important in your life. And when something happens that affects your concerns, then we are talking about an emotion. And so what people do is they appraise the situation or the event. And this appraisal is like you lose something, you think something is threatening to you, you find something repulsive. All these types of appraisals are sort of assessments in relation to your concerns. And an appraisal is always followed by an action tendency. And the action tendency is, for instance, if you find something very unfair, then the action tendency is that you want to remove that obstacle, or that you want to confront that person, or that you want to make a change. That together is the feeling, the subjective feeling of anger. And that goes with certain behaviors, certain nonverbal expressions, and certain physiological changes. And that can all be regulated in all kinds of different ways. I'm not going to talk about that right now. So this whole range of components ranging from appraisals to action repertoires to behavior, there are discrete patterns of those emotions, and together they form, as Jan Willem already said, it is an urgent and immediate and short-term reaction. So what we have been talking about in psychology is what type of emotions do you have and what unique patterns of appraisals and action tendencies you have. And the question is very often, how many do we have? Are there 6 emotions? Because that is what Paul Ekman, the most famous emotion researcher in the world, Paul Ekman said there are 6 basic emotions, and that's it. Later he added another one and another one, but that doesn't matter. The discussion about how many we have is still going on. And so, for instance, we have recent research based on Cohen and Keltner in the US, who found on the basis of the feelings that people reported in response to different videos, more than 2,000 videos they collected from the internet and showed it to participants. And what they found is that there are 27 distinct emotional states. So not 6, not 9, 27. Well, I mean, we can go on debating how many there are. It's not very important in my view. What is important, though, is that it is not very clear what belongs to an emotion category in total and what not. So there is a sort of fuzzy boundary. It's not this is an emotion and that is not an emotion. And so, for instance, boredom and fatigue, some people think it's an emotion. Well, some people think it's an absence of emotion. Love, some people think it's emotion, it's the most important emotion in life, but it's not very short-term, immediate. And so, is it really an emotion or not? So there are lots of questions about whether some emotions are emotions. But it's clear that there are a couple of emotions that are very typical for the category of emotions and that also fulfill the criteria of physiological changes, nonverbal expressions, clear action tendencies, and so on. And so anger, sadness, fear, and so on, they are the good examples. By the way, it's very interesting that a colleague of Jan Willem, Marcy Cottingham, has just published a paper in an important journal in which she says there are neo-emotions. And these are actually all kinds of new emotions that occur in social media, on the internet, and so on, which can be considered emotions and that do not belong to any of those categories. Neo-emotions. Remember the name. So the question is, what are then political emotions? Well, that's relatively easy. Emotions expressed by or directed at politicians or political parties. And here you see a couple of examples of expressions by politicians. Like Sigrid Kaag, Donald Trump. This is a typical contempt face of Donald Trump. He very often shows that. Political emotions are also about political topics like the farmers and the toeslagenschandaal. What's that in English? I don't know the English word for that. But you can see, you can see anything. Anyhow, so political topics. And they can be very wide. It need not be only about political parties. Political movements are clearly part of it. So the Extinction Rebellion, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, the pro-Palestinian movement, all part of the political realm. So the features of political emotions. So if are political emotions any different from other emotions? In principle not, only that they are expressed by politicians or targeted at politicians and about political topics. But what is important is they have two features that are different from some of the other emotions. And that is, they are long-term sentiments, and they are group-based. Long-term because we often identify, for instance, as liberal or conservative or PVV-stemmer or any of those political things, or left and right. And so that is a sentiment that belongs to you for a much longer time than only at one specific moment. And it's lingering on the background, these types of sentiments. And when something happens, when a politician says something, or when there is a demonstration against something, then those emotions stir up and make it easier when you have these long-term sentiments already in place. The second feature, the group-based feature, is also very important because politics are ingrained also very often in social life and in one's emotional life. So group-based sentiments are related to our social identities, and it means that what we share certain views on the world, we share the appraisals, we share certain collective action tendencies, and that makes a political emotion not just an individual one. We know that other people who think like us also have these political views. And that makes the emotion, the political emotion, very strong. There is never anyone who thinks that, well, maybe someone, but almost never anyone who thinks that his or her political views are really idiosyncratic, are only felt by yourself. No, you know that there are other people also feeling the same thing. One other very relevant feature of group-based emotions is that they are contagious. And that means that they easily spread. And they spread certainly in situations that are seen as uncertain or ambiguous. When you don't know what's happening, you look at other people to know their emotional reactions and to imitate it, to share their views. It's always, I find the example, I have an example of Pieter Omtzigt here, but there was a lot of talking about Pieter Omtzigt already. So there's another example. When there is a turbulence in the plane, this is quite a different example. A turbulence in the plane, and it gets more and more, then people start looking at each other to see how they interpret this situation. And as long as that takes, you only need one person to cry out loud, "We are going to crash," and the whole plane is panicking. And this is only when because there is uncertainty, because we don't have enough information to assess that. And of course, because it's quite dangerous if the plane is falling down, but anyhow. So that's quite different from what Pieter Omtzigt did, and that's what you find often especially in populist politicians, that they sketch a kind of scenario of the future. And so we don't know what's exactly going on in the future. We know that anything can happen. And because it is in the future, people are very sensitive to the emotions that other people have about that future. And so, for instance, Pieter Omtzigt said, he said something about the low birth rate in the Netherlands, plus the large number of children born in Ethiopia and other African countries in relation to migration problems in the Netherlands. And then he said, guess what this means in 20 years' time. So this is the doom thinking that leads people to feel anxious and threatened. The other thing is emotions are shared with other people. If you if you encounter an emotional event, if you feel very emotional, very angry, or very sad, or very happy, then you share that with others. There's lots of evidence that people do that all the time. And that is especially the case, of course, if you are in groups, but you share it with your intimates and with your friends and with your colleagues. So in no time, the emotion is shared with all kinds of people, which also make it quite contagious. The last reason why when emotions are contagious is when we feel it in groups. When there's a collective presence, you see others feel the same thing. It means that the emotion is shared, whether it's a demonstration or a political campaign or something else. If you are in a crowd, you feel the emotion much stronger than when you're alone. Also, lots of evidence for that. So, when we talk about emotions, the suggestion might be that emotions are not good for anything, that they are disruptive and lead to biases and impulsive behavior and so on. It's clear that I don't think that this is the case. So there are two general social functions, in my view, of emotions. One is the distancing and the other is the affiliation. So emotions help to coordinate the social relations in a group, but also interpersonally. And so they either lead to distancing, in the case of anger and hate, contempt, but also pride being you're better than others. And so that also leads to a distance between persons or group. And affiliation, which means that you come closer to others. And that not only applies to happiness, but also to sadness, shame, guilt, or guilt. Because in the case of shame and guilt, you are submissive. You try to apologize, and therefore you try to approach other people better. So what does that mean for the social functions of political emotions? In that case, there is an affiliation with your political in-group, that is the function of emotions, and a distancing from the out-group. And it has a couple of functions, other functions as well. So it solves the uncertainty, because it leads to these shared beliefs about the world. It strengthens one's need to belong, and that means that you have a stronger social identity and also the need for larger meaning in one's life. If we talk about social identity and the function of emotions, there's very interesting research on hate groups in the US of white supremacists. And they only get along with, they only are close, have connections to people who have similar views. And everyone who has different views is not in their private life as well. So their social connections to the ideology of white supremacism is so strong that it's very hard to quit. It's very hard to leave that group because of these interconnections. And so it is compared with a sort of addiction. Being part of these hate groups, they sometimes call it, is actually being addicted to that ideology and to that family of people. And so this shows the function of emotions, even though maybe the types of group that I'm talking about is not a very positive thing. Finally, the increase of political power. There's lots of research showing that when you feel anger as a group, you feel much more powerful and have the idea that you can really change something, which is far more than when you have this feeling on your own. So back to the question of Jan Willem, who said that affective polarization is increasing. I'm not entirely sure whether that is the case, because he has to prove that, I think, whether this is really the case, but we'll talk about that later. Let's assume that the affective polarization is indeed increasing. Then the question is, what has changed? Well, lots have changed. There is a lot of, there is a big increase in armed conflicts in the world. There has been a health crisis. There is a migration crisis, at least according to some people. There is a climate crisis, also according to some people. So there are lots of different crises in the world, and there are lots of different threats, and people feel anxious about that. And so the fact that this is also on the news everywhere also makes it very accessible and very salient. So we're bombarded with news about these different types of crises, and that makes people feel anxious. And we know, done research on the relation between feelings of threat and all kinds of anger-like emotions, which shows that whatever threat, so whether it's about the climate or your health or the energy crisis or migration, doesn't matter what, all these crises lead to stronger feelings of anger and anxiety. In addition, in the Netherlands, we have a decrease of feelings of trust in the government. The government doesn't listen and doesn't do enough, and it is quite low right now, these feelings of trust. And so it's completely obvious that people have a lot of emotions. That is not strange, it's not bad, and we should take them seriously. So, Jan Willem Duyvendak. Emotions in the center of the political debate is dangerous. Actually, I think you're sort of going back to the old dichotomy of passion versus reason. And so the idea that emotions would lead to affective polarization, or that it may not reflect actual concerns, suggests that emotions are not good assessments. I would say they are based on actual concerns that people have, and they are also based on actual appraisals. These appraisals may be quick, they may be a bit biased sometimes, but they are assessments of the situation. They are actually value judgments, as many philosophers also argue. So emotions are value judgments, and that means that they are judgments and that they should be taken seriously. So the affective polarization in social psychology, we have studied this for decades, and it's called in-group favoritism and out-group derogation. My colleagues here, who are all in social psychology, know everything about it. So in-group, basically affective polarization is similar to in-group favoritism and out-group derogation. And the interesting thing is that this applies for all types of groups. We like our own group more, and we don't like the out-group. We have artificially created groups in the lab, being the reds and the blues and all that. Always works, whatever you do. So in-group favorism and out-group derogation is part of social life. So the question is, has affective polarization indeed increased? And if so, why would that be the case? I can think of a couple of answers, namely the increased need to belong to a social group or to give your life more meaning. That could be a reason why affective polarization between the groups is increasing as well. The social media filter bubbles could be a reason because it creates the groups and reinforces the groups. And the anonymity of the internet is another reason. We know that when you speak to people in a live setting, it's much harder to say to someone that she's a bitch or a witch or that she should die or whatever you read on X. So anonymous messaging makes those types of hate messages easier, and also easier to support if you don't see the person whom it is about. So the question is, when is affective polarization actually dysfunctional? And I think if you look at emotions more generally, when are they dysfunctional? When they are expressed too much, when they transgress certain rules and norms that we have, and also when the goal of the emotion is not met. So, for instance, if we talk about anger, in an interpersonal setting, it's quite clear. Someone who is always angry, you don't take this person seriously anymore. So the goal of the anger, namely to change the other person, is not working. And so then it can become dysfunctional. Same applies to group-based anger. If the group-based anger is too often and too extreme, then the question is whether the goals are still met. And another reason is that sometimes the emotion can change from a constructive emotion to a destructive emotion. And that is the case when anger turns into hate or contempt. The emotion hate and the emotion contempt implies that people think of someone or a group as a bad person or as an evil-natured person. And that means that the attribution, the appraisal, is a sort of permanent, and means that you don't think that this person or this group will ever change. And so the difference between anger as something you say about the behavior of another person and hate or contempt in which you really think they are so bad it will never change is a very important one. When the group's goals are missed, I just said it, when there is too often too extreme actions, collective actions, then the group's goals might be missing, although I don't know what the conditions would be when it is and when it doesn't work. What is finally very important is when the social connections between groups who hate each other or who dislike each other, when that social connection is completely gone, then we should start to worry. So that is when affective polarization is dysfunctional, but I'm not sure whether it's always dysfunctional. And so the question is more, it's not the liking of your own group, that's no problem. It's the disliking of the other group that is a problem, and that might be increasing indeed. So my conclusion is that we cannot demand to have less emotions. We cannot just assume that we can do away with the emotions. Because emotions are there, they are elicited because people have concerns that are real, and emotions are based on those concerns. So I would say without emotions, no democracy, because it means that people are committed to politics and that they feel engaged. And if you don't feel that, then it will be, well, then I don't think it will work anymore. But I'm not a political scientist, of course. Are emotions at risk? I think what is important is that we don't say emotions don't count as an argument. They do count as an argument because when people say, I'm just angry, you know that they find something unfair and that they want to change that. And so I think the politicians or scholars should be able to translate feelings, because it's for many people it's easier to express their feelings than to give complex arguments about certain things. So I think the translation would be very important. And finally, I think we need to examine the emotions and what lies behind them rather than say they are a risk. Thank you.
I think we have to decide whether we first discuss what emotionalization of politics is about, or that we immediately go to the affective polarization. What do you prefer?
You may say it.
Perhaps very.
You had a lot of time to.
Yeah. Well, perhaps if I may kick off the first point then. So, what is this very broad idea of emotionalization about? Right? It's not just about emotionalization of politics, but also emotionalization much broader of society. And perhaps there are two things that are happening at the same time, and we should be more precise. The first is that it is not necessarily that those emotions were never there in politics or public life, but they have become far more explicit. They count as arguments, and they are welcomed and appreciated as arguments. Perhaps for good reasons, we come to that, but they are there and they are appreciated, and politicians almost force themselves to be emotional because it is good to be an emotional person in politics these days. And that is because then it shows that you're authentic, you listen to your emotions. So I think in general there the idea is that it's not necessary that it is new, but it is shown, right? The display rules have changed. It is a good thing if emotions are out there. The other argument, whether or not there's emotionalization, has to do with the question, are there new emotions that were not there before? So do emotions have traveled from the private sphere to the public sphere? And there I think that one can mention a couple of emotions that in the earlier days were mostly experienced at home or in the neighborhood, or not something attached to the nation.
Romantic love.
Now that these days, like feeling at home or belonging, are part and parcel of political discourse. If I may give one example to be more concrete, Fenne Pinkster and we are asked by the municipality of Amsterdam to look into their policies because they are not so sure anymore whether indeed they should have this policy of increased feeling at home of people living in Amsterdam by 2% per year. But when we looked into it, we thought it is even worse. Because in Amsterdam, the mayor in every speech tells us that everybody has to feel him or her or their selves in Amsterdam, right? So during Pride, it's even on flags, right? So be yourself, feel yourself. Which in itself, I would say, is a ridiculous idea if everybody feels or does what he or she feels. I mean, in the sense that I think it is good that it is regulated. We all understand that it has to do with LGBTQI, right? But in general, the idea that politicians tell us to be totally ourselves and to feel to the maximum ourselves is surprising, but is a new thing. In the earlier days, you were supposed to have those feelings at home in the private sphere. So I think emotionalization is two things: more explicit and some new emotions that have traveled, the blurring of the private and the public.
Yeah, I don't think that politicians showing their emotions is necessarily a good thing. I think that most of the politicians who have shown emotions are not really rewarded for that. I'm talking about crying of politicians, but also indeed the enraging of politicians. I think that most of the evaluations that you see in newspapers or news shows is not positive. And the only thing that sometimes said, yeah, it's good that this person is authentic, but then after that we don't vote on this for this person anymore. So I don't think it is necessarily good unless you have a very good excuse. So I've been studying crying politicians, also to see whether there's a gender difference in there, which is not necessarily the case, but they are not publicly evaluated in a very favored way normally. So I don't think the emotions by politicians is the emotions displayed by politicians is really a good example of the emotionalization of politics. I think it's more in what you say, that what is being asked of people to feel in a certain way, that may be new, but the question is, how different is it from what has been said in the past, namely, it's good to have your own identity. And you should defend your own identity. And now it's phrased in terms of feelings. You should feel who you are. But how different is it?
I think it's very different. First, to go back to your argument about politicians, obviously this is an empirical question, so there might be data out there about it. But I think that Trump is only emotions, right? I mean, it is so much about emotions, and he doesn't care. It shows that he thinks that it will pay off. So I think there is really a big change, and as you say, right, the gender component is extremely interesting, because in the earlier days women were disqualified because they were overly emotional, and now Harris was actually teasing him to become emotional, right? So it is an interesting reverse of gender there. Yeah, I really think that not only the way they display it, but also what they are discussing is so much more about emotions. And of course it has to do also with debates about immigration, and therefore belonging has become like every other sentence of a politician these days is about who belongs here, who doesn't belong here, why do people think they belong here, but also about their own belonging, right? So in that discussion they show how much they belong themselves. Whereas I think it should be a discussion, where does belonging belong?
But is belonging not the same as what we used to call integration?
Well, in the earlier days, but I'm not going to romanticize the earlier days of integration policies, but in the earlier days it was more, at least at the start, about formal things, about getting to know Dutch society by the rules and regulations, somewhat the manners. But now today we ask immigrants to feel Dutch and to show their loyalty, right? So it's about what you say, long-term emotions, but also there is a ceremony in the municipality, and at that moment they have to experience the emotion that they want to belong to the Netherlands. So I think we have become far more demanding in emotional terms.
Thank you so much, Jan Willem, for the fantastic lecture. Thank you so much, Agneta, for the fantastic lecture, and also thank you very much, Agneta, for your service and mentorship over the last years.
No, thanks.
And thank you also.